Our theme for this segment was sort of the inspiration process and what that entails. It's a little bit of a nebulous concept, so I thought that I would start with the work of the people that are sitting up on stage right now. So maybe Jordan, could you go first and just talk a little bit about what you sent? I asked each one of the panelists here to present a little piece of inspiration and the work that resulted from that. And hopefully by looking at that, we'll be able to start getting into the meat of the conversation with a little bit more grounding and a little less, sort of things pulled out of thin air. So,
Nice piece.
I think I'm just gonna...
So I'm inspired by the word
Jordan
creative.
Crane. And your first slide was a dog.
Yeah, it's a dog, but it's kind of what the dog is doing. I think one of the big things for me, and this is it's a weird thing to think about, what inspires you. You're kind of getting into the realm of God and stuff. But one of the things that I think helps me is just taking a walk, and I swear to God. And I don't mean like a walk around the block. I mean kind of pushing yourself, like go like 5, 6, 7 miles, and just let your mind wander. Because I think probably most of us up here know, like, you're in a room all day with a group of people, and you're in front of these screens, and you're getting bombarded by stuff. And I think there's a balance that has to happen. And for me, I have to have this, or else I just pop. But I think as in terms of an exercise, it's try it.
So, I've gone the wrong direction. The next slide you present, I don't know what the connection in here is.
Well, I think this is also, like, to go back to the walk thing, I think when you let your mind wander, it forces you to look at things in different ways. And kind of, we've all been in the ads with, or been in the airline terminals when we've seen those HSBC ads. There's kind of something to it, like, what do you see there? I don't know. Is it death, or is it life? But I think if you don't ask those questions as you go into, like, the job part of our job, then you might be missing something. But then I think also for me, it's sort of like, dude, you could be fucking gone tomorrow, so you better just...
By a lion.
Yeah. And I think you kind of gotta bring it, because you got nothing to lose. Like, really, you got nothing to lose. So,
On that spiritual note.
okay, so this takes us to an actual job. So this is a job we did for Belkin. You guys know who they are? Apple, little Belkin, do your cases and stuff. Big strategic shift for them, moving into home automation and cloud computing and sort of all things for your home. And one of the big things that they're trying to do is tell a story that what they're doing is all about you. It's all about people. It's all about, helping you connect to the things that impassion your life. Well, okay, that's great. But then, that's a lot to think about, and that's a lot to consider. But if we step back and we keep going back and back and back, and if it is about people, well, what are those things as people connect us together? Well, for inspiration, I think at one time or another, we've all looked up in the stars. And I think the thing about the stars is it's also a place where you start to imagine, you start to dream, but you start to form connections, right? So you start to see things in the stars. You go to the next one.
There you go.
And so, what better way to represent that than is to sort of claim this inspiration and imagination through the form of little starman, little human. But I think the thing that's really nice about this is that Belkin as a company, instead of filling it in and saying, like, what we see in people is sort of, this is what we see in people, they're saying we see the potential for you to see what you want to see, and we're going to help you do that. So that's just kind of it.
So, Joe, sorry, Jordan, are you, when you started off in this process, did you start with visuals, or were you just thinking about this in terms of words and sort of, the meaning of what you were trying to do.
Yeah, I don't think I ever really start with visuals. I think visuals are around us all the time. I think it's almost that's the last place to go. I think the first place to go is, like I said, just kind of let your mind wander.
So it sounds like you're sort of giving yourself the permission to ask why you're even doing the thing that you're doing.
Absolutely, 100%.
That's nicely said. So, Natasha, I wanted to give you a chance, too, to talk about your work just for a second. Sure. So we'll go to the next thing. Natasha, if you didn't hear earlier, is from Pentagram, just recently joined the firm. And your first slide here is an image that'll be familiar to some of you, but Natasha, go ahead.
Sure. So I want to present a pretty specific, like a case study. I think that the idea, the topic of inspiration, it's so broad, and the definition varies, is different from one person to another, and how do you actually begin to talk about such broad and personal topic? So what I'm going to present here is a project that we did last year. It's actually, it came about as an identity project. The client is Nuit Blanche, New York. So Nuit Blanche is it's very hard to describe who they are. They are a global network collective with locally organized art events of contemporary art that happens at nighttime. So Nuit Blanche New York, which is their New York group, approached us for an identity, and they had an event, coming up very rapidly with a new museum. And the event was very specific in the Bowery area. So it's a very interesting project because basically there needed to be two identities. One is for the group itself, Nuit Blanche New York, and the other identity is for the event. The event is called Flashlight. So we started to think about what actually really essentializes what Nuit Blanche does and what this event is about. I think that's sort of how we always, approach a project, to really kind of distill very essentials, about the project. So, Nuit Blanche, all their events take place in urban spaces, which I think is very critical, and it's something that's very unique to them. So when you start thinking about urban spaces, first thing that comes to mind is the idea of a grid or a grid system. So that somehow just brought us to the work done by Super Studio. So some of you may be very familiar with their work. It was an architecture group started in the 70s and in Italy. And their work was interesting because they used architecture as a kind of means to question the social role of architecture. So rather than just producing objects, producing buildings, they want to use architecture. They use a lot of collages, to actually question what is the world that we were living in today. And they question a lot about technology, about consumer culture. But one motif that was very, very particular to their work is this continuous grid. So the idea of the grid in their work is about unifying all kinds of different spaces and unifying people. And I think that idea, apart from the visual form itself, that idea was very, very compelling to us, because I think that when you think about urban spaces, it's really this grid that unifies all kinds of different conditions together. So what we did was basically taking the very idea of the grid and kind of transforming it into a kind of morphing identity. So, a grid is basically omnidirectional. Every point is equal, and you can turn it in different ways. So the way that we utilized it is that for the group, for the Nuit Blanche group itself, their identity is basically this morphing grid that you can turn it and morph it in, in any direction that you like. But when it comes to a specific event, there will be a point, we call it the activator, that will come out from the grid itself, that kind of identifies the event itself. And what's interesting is that the idea of the grid can really play out beautifully across different platforms and dimensions. As you're looking at this animation, this video, which was a 25-story building at Times Square. So they got this building to promote the event Flashlight, and we had about like 24 hours to do this video. So initially they were just thinking about having some ads, like what you typically see at Times Square. But for us, it was just a great opportunity to actually really utilize this identity and use it in its very optimized form.
Sure. So actually, one thing that we sort of skipped over there in your listening to you talk about the role that grids play in the city is actually the process that got you between, sort of thinking about this as a city-based project and thinking about this as something that was related to a grid. Was there actually a process that you used to get there, or, how do you sort of? Because it seems to me like once you got that grid idea, things sort of started falling into place. So how did you get to that point to begin with?
Well, this project is kind of anomaly, because I think that the assignment itself was, it had very clear qualities, I think, to begin with, but typically a lot of projects come in a really, really blurry way. So how do we actually, begin to kind of research or, begin to understand the project? And I always kind of think of inspirations as, it's not an action, it's rather a state of preparation, because when you're inspired, you are prompted to do something or to make something. You may not do it immediately, but you will do it, eventually. And I think that when you actually see certain things or certain conditions that kind of deviates from your normal condition or from whatever heritage that thing is, I think that creates a kind of inspirational moment, as illustrated in Jordan's image, where this lion or, whatever beast is on top of the another beast. I think that's a kind of condition that really deviates from what we're normally used to. So for us, it's really about every day. I always encourage like myself and my team. I've been doing this for years, which is that I'm obsessively looking at things all the time. I mean, which we can talk about how you actually parse and organize all these things that you actually encounter on a daily basis.
Does anybody else on the panel actually have a strategy for just that sort of thing? Because I suspect that as designers, you're always collecting. I mean, that's really 90% of the job is collecting all the time. Does anybody want to respond to what Natasha said?
There's kind of this magical thing about what's going on in digital right now is there's all these designers creating tools to help out other designers, which is really interesting. And there's lots of these services now, like Found and Supply and Pinterest and all these things. And at the core, it's about inspiring yourself to take certain kind of actions. It could be transactional, to go buy something, or it could be to remind yourself of a great idea, or a lot of the times to be there when you need it, because so often you come across something in happenstance, where then later you really have to jumpstart your creative juices. So to have a resource available for you to be able to do that is great, and it's lovely that we don't have to cut things out anymore. And there's actually this sort of world of tools to help us do that. So.
I'm wondering actually if you ever find yourself wanting to push back against those tools, though, because as I look at Found and Supply and those things, I see them, I look at them every day, and I find them, in a lot of ways, I feel like they're forcing a particular aesthetic or a particular presentation on me. And they can actually have like a kind of almost deadening effect when you see things curated so specifically.
Yeah, there's like the hipster aesthetic, and like someone did this like amazing blog post of rebranding current brands with like the hipster aesthetic. So it's like circles and like
that appeared on our site, by the way.
It was so funny. It was like perfect, right? And so everything like does end up being like semi-homogeneous, which is interesting to a point, but it apparently is the design movement of current, and we all kind of see these design trends, and sometimes all of us have to jump back and jump out of that. So, I mean, me specifically, and I guess I'll talk about this for my example, like going back to the past, like going back like decades ago can really be a breath of fresh air, or to Jordan's point, being inspired by things completely divorced of the industry that we're in, because it is a bit insular and it is a bit inbred in a way, because you start to see the same ideas over and over again. So it is lovely that it's there for a certain level of inspiration, but it's an idea of like local peaks and global peaks, like you can get really excited about the small thing, but there's bigger things on the horizon if you kind of force yourself to jump out and look for it.
Actually, I wonder, Natasha, your work, it's very visual. It's it has a lot of motion in it. Jordan, the thing that you presented was an identity. And Joe, you mentioned that you work a lot on digital projects. I'm wondering if there is a gap there in inspiration for you guys in sort of seeing, it's very easy to look at a still image, but it's not necessarily so obvious what inspires you to create an interaction or something that moves or something that requires, input on the user's part. There's a slip between those two products. I'm wondering if any of you guys have ways of looking at the world that sort of starts pulling in some of that input. Anybody?
I feel like I'm talking too much, but
That's okay.
I mean, I think that, well, it's actually pretty difficult to be inspired by the world of digital right now because it's a very new medium. Like commercial digital has like at best been around for 15 years, so there's really not a great history of work to look at, and there are no great digital designers yet. We're all in the first generation of them, so it's actually really hard to be inspired about making digital by digital. But something that's actually unbelievably inspiring is looking at the end user and what their problems are. So really talking to a person or your mom or a customer or their own ever business about the goals that they're trying to achieve. And sometimes they can be simple goals like, I want to buy a plane ticket. And that can be really inspiring to understand the problems that they have to go through. And then using the medium of design in order to solve that problem is actually typically much more inspiring than a type treatment or a great color palette or a beautiful poster. The inspiring part is understanding the problem, proposing a solution, testing it, and having it work. That's really unbelievably powerfully inspiring.
Rob, you're nodding your head. I'm wondering if you sort of do a similar sort of step back from the actual project and sort of do an ethnographic sort of take at what you're trying to do.
I think for me, I'm going to lean in because I'm kind of like the mumble and quiet talker. But I think for me, it's more of a process than anything, and I think that's the if I can even sort of like steal something that happened with my team earlier, I kind of didn't know what to do for this in general, and then I think just going through this process of like engaging them in what was happening and having a conversation about it and sort of thinking about it as a series of actions that can in some way produce a result without really knowing what that result is going to be or even sort of what the goal is. I think that there's a general goal, obviously, but I think allowing this sort of organic process to exist, and this is what with sort of the tools that exist online is the main bummer for me, is that through Google search or whatever it is, like that organic process sort of becomes very streamlined and predictable, and there's no real like organic growth that can happen out of that. So I think that's sort of the way that I'm trying to approach the inspiration, and I think that if you develop this process, maybe it can apply to buying an airline ticket. It can apply to like looking for an image, or it can apply to sort of making something, whether it's a design or an interaction or sort of an intervention or an experience. And I think that's sort of it's unfortunate because I feel like in the digital space there is the most opportunity for that to happen. But then I feel like the sort of regulation that's been established at this point through searches and other sort of image-based collection sites is kind of taking it down a notch a little bit.
So with that, actually, this is probably a good segue into your inspiration slide.
So once again, I'll talk about this. This was kind of the result of our conversation as a team, and it's a list of names, people, groups, other things that have inspired me throughout time. I think it's the most point of view I can have without really having a point of view. And I think that they were also sort of, through our conversation with these talks, it's sort of like I'm going to be inspired by the things that inspire me, and I think everybody should be inspired by the things that inspire them personally, but then maybe, so I can't really describe a process, but maybe I can describe some reference points, because one of the most inspiring things for me also is, beyond the conversation, is sort of seeing and learning about new things that I didn't know. And so I kind of want to just put up this list of people and groups so you could, possibly steal it and go online and look at it later, but, and then we'll all be doing the same thing, so.
I'm actually really curious about the name at the very end, Big Freedia. Do you have any thoughts
yes.
in particular about Big Freedia?
Just really good feelings. I think so. I don't know if you've ever seen Big Frida in concert or whatever. Yes. So, like the most amazing, most powerful, like positive kind of energy comes from this person, and the performances will blow your mind. So, that's the. I don't know. Just like every time I watch it, it makes me happy. So, I think it makes
You
me
didn't
good
say
for-
why you said person and not,
Right.
I think you missed out the main point.
Yes, I think that the mixed gender, not really living in one space or the other, but I think that that's amazing. So
And rapping about it.
yeah, and rapping about it, and like can move the ass like nobody I've ever seen. So
So let's look at the work that you were.
and so out of that, it's kind of like, I don't know. I feel like in the industry, you can sort of have whatever reference points you want for inspiration, and a lot of stuff. At Mother, we basically have a series of blackboards, and this is possible, it happens in other places, but we are always putting images up on these blackboards with little pins. It's slightly archaic in the way that it happens. We've talked about like graduating to magnets or something, I don't know, but it still like seems a little in the olden days. But we kind of always seeing these inspirational things going in front of us, and out of that, there's always sort of a result. And these images were actually taken for a deodorant campaign, and sort of that aspect that it is for a deodorant, and that you can sort of have like a really kind of like tender, sweet heart on an armpit, really sort of like makes me excited. Because I think that it does show that through the right sort of inspiration, you can arrive at a place that even within a category that has sort of expected results, maybe it has to be like super humorous or whatever it is, you can kind of switch that direction if you sort of put the right things together.
Well said. Jordan, I'm curious. I just wanted to move it back down the panel and ask you. You mentioned about taking a walk, doing something that gets you out of your mental space, which is something that a lot of neuroscientists talk about, and it's something that I think is probably pretty intuitive to a lot of people here. But backing up, between that, giving yourself that necessary space and actually doing the work, there's obviously lots of processes that are involved. I'm wondering if you work now differently than you did when you were, let's say, 10 years younger, knowing what you know about your creative process.
Oh yeah, I mean, I think it's honestly, it's just experience and going through it, and also realizing what my job is now. I think my job is to really question, my team and myself and what we're doing, and ultimately, hopefully, just that we're pushing what we're doing. And so I think, when I was younger, it was just like, oh yeah, balls out, that's fucking great. It's expressive, it's doing all those things we think design should be doing, but it's not really solving anyone's issues or problems. So I think as you go through the process and you realize that you're not a one-man band, and you are trying to solve people's business issues and trying to express a strategy for a business that could be a group of 10 people or a group of 10,000 people, and they've come to us to help them bring their personality out to the world, then it's like, shit, that's a lot to take in. That's a lot of responsibility. So I have to be responsible and question myself, but then I also have to be responsible and let go of it at a certain time as well too, because that's ultimately why why clients come to us as well too, is because we do take that step and sort of letting go at the same time.
Yeah, is that letting go something that any of you guys have had to sort of teach yourself as you've grown into the role of not necessarily, doing the actual creating the file yourself or whatever the case may be? I mean, at some point you have to let your team sort of start working their way through the problem that you've presented for them. So I'm wondering whether or not you guys had to teach yourselves that and how you did it.
I always try to encourage my teams to come up with their ideas. I think that sometimes a project itself presents certain problems that are, that can be solved in pretty obvious ways. I think that's just sort of like your first impulse. But I think that by giving the team some time, to actually explore their ideas, I think that way you kind of really mine what's going on in everybody's head. And sometimes the results or, the answers that you get are just completely crazy and inspiring, and I prefer to work that way rather than say a kind of top-down approach, say here's the idea, now you go execute it.
Do you think that top-down approach still exists in the industry? Is that something that you guys see a lot?
Definitely. I think that, I think, again, I think it depends on the nature of the projects and scale of projects and the very moment, for example, when there's a tight deadline, things have to be resolved immediately. How do you go about it? How do you deal with it? Then maybe in that situation, a top-down approach may be appropriate. But I think that in general, I prefer to deploy kind of more open-ended approach.
I'm curious, actually, how big of the teams do you guys each work on? Because I suspect that we're talking about radically different sized teams on the stage right now.
Yeah, there's 3.
Just 3
Yeah.
for you?
Pentagram is interesting, as you guys may already know, that Pentagram seems large, but then it comprises of different partners, and each partner has his or her own team. And right now, we have a very small team of 3 people. Yeah.
Joe?
So Huge is 500 people, and basically what happens is different parts of a project requires different kinds of people. So generally, really, you have a strategy lead and a creative lead partnering with a client services person, and they oversee everyone. But then you bring in different groups of people to do the research, and then the strategy, and then the UX, and then the design, and then the tech. So maybe up to 50 different people will touch something, but it will usually be in groups of maybe 10 at a time over the course of a few months.
So you're talking about you're talking about phased as opposed to a bunch of parallel stuff.
Yeah, I mean, there's clearly overlap, and there's a lot that you can learn and be inspired by people coming to the same problem from a different discipline. But in order to first decide what the problem is, and then come up with a potential solution for that problem, and then to design that problem, and then to build that solution, and then to deploy it, is just different kinds of people right now. There's no one there's very few people who are really good at all of that. So our current strategy is basically hiring specialists. Everyone tends to bleed a little bit out, and to be a good strategist, you should be a pretty decent creative. To be a good creative, you should be a pretty decent technologists, et cetera, et cetera. But just the scale of the things that we have to do, you just kind of need lots of different kinds of people.
So how do you keep the project actually whole and intact, when
Yeah.
you're talking about?
So it's a challenge, it's difficult. So mostly what we try to do is have sort of champions of the project from beginning to end. And those people, I think their core goal really is to define the goal and have everyone agree upon what the goal is. And if everyone working on the team agrees what the finish line looks like, and the client agrees at what the finish line looks like, and we think that real people, real customers will be excited by what then it becomes pretty easy to vet potential solutions. So that sort of strategy and creative partnership is really about setting up the rules, and having lots of people come in and bounce against those rules. You sort of, from the top, define the way that you're going. You can hopefully develop a good project over the course of what turns into 9 or 15-month projects of just being really vigilant about what you originally stood for, trying not to compromise on what that goal looks like. And you'll have ups and downs, obviously, within a project of that length. But if the finish line never changes, then hopefully you can have something that will be successful.
Jordan, what kind of teams are you guys working with at Wolff Olins?
I think it all depends on the project. I mean, it could be, I'm doing something by myself after hours, or it could be I'm working with a team of like 400 people around the world, implementing a big project. So it kind of all depends, but, on sort of an average, it's probably about same thing. It's like 2 or 3 strategists, 2 or 3 designers sort of all together jamming on things to
Sure.
get it done.
Sure. So, I mean, when you're not connected to the people that, I'm curious as to how people get really passionate when they're working in the same room. Like, they start seeing things the same way, but, as you sort of try to communicate across offices or across, locales or functions or whatever, I mean, is that something that you have difficulty, like, conveying and sort of infecting people with?
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the things I sort of wonder every day is like, God, I think we could be more creative at being creative. Because it's sort of like, okay, wait a second. All right, it's 9:30. Let's get in a room and come up with something. Really? I don't know. Maybe can we make it like 8 and see if we don't have any coffee? Maybe what happens? So, I mean, that's an obvious example, but like, I think like, as an industry, there's like, we're all in these little rooms and these little boxes, and we're all sort of behind these screens, or we have these 1-hour meetings where we have to try to accomplish some big time stuff. And I don't know, I'm just sort of like, this is what this talk has forced me to think about. Like, what can I do with my own team, or, where I work, or even you guys, what could we do to just sort of think like, okay, how could I be more creative today in getting my team to be more creative? Like maybe I say, what, no design blogs for the week. Only look at, like puppies being born or something. That would be pretty fucking inspiring, So I think that's what I've learned from this talk. Thank you.
Before, I don't want to run out of time, so Joe, we've got your slides next.
Sure.
So if you could just talk to us a little bit about this lovely coffee grinder.
So as I kind of like alluded to earlier, it's really, really hard to be inspired by digital just because it's so new. There's just like not very much of it, and a lot of it isn't that good, and there's a lot of it. There's like, the last thing the world needs is another website, right? So I've been more inspired by the past than I think ever in my career, and both musically and kind of with design. And this is like a coffee maker or coffee grinder that I have in my office. And I guess what I like about it is if you were to ask 1,000 people what they would want out of a coffee grinder, they would all say one thing, which is, I just want to grind coffee. That's it, right? So that's all that this does. It does nothing else but grind coffee, and there's one button. Like, that's it. It does absolutely nothing other than the one thing that people really want. There's no bells and whistles. There's not modes. There's not settings. There's not, like, ornaments on it or whatever. But the one button is bright day-glow orange. So it only does the one thing that you really want it to do, but it does it in a way that you can really enjoy just through this small kind of active design. And I think like lots of really good design follows the same pattern of understanding what someone is interested in doing and then delivering that to them in a way that they can enjoy. And there's lots of kind of examples of that through history. And then this is kind of one of the examples that Huge has developed. So actually, Brian, this kid over here, was designing this page, and this is the HBO iPad app. So if you ask 1,000 people, which we did, what do you want an iPad app from HBO to do? They all say the same thing. I want to watch The Sopranos. I want to watch True Blood. That's all they say. When you ask industry insiders or the client, what should the HBO iPad app do? They say really different things, like maybe it should be a co-viewing experience or develop special content like just for this, or you can talk to the vampires behind the scenes or like different angles and you like slide it around and like
horrible.
all this stuff. Right. So all people really want is to watch The Sopranos. It's one thing. They want to press play. Just show me the play button. So So there's lots of ways to do that, though, right? Like YouTube has a play button, Hulu has one, Netflix has one. And HBO's press play has to feel like HBO. It has to feel kind of like expensive and luxurious and premium and like you're getting the best stuff in the world. So that was really the goal. So when we were kind of kicking it off in the initial stages of sort of like setting up the rules, like the rules were, there were two rules. One, all this person wants to do is watch a video, so kill every
Different concerns, you know.
like HBO. It has to be that orange button. You have to enjoy the act of pressing play.
Nicely put. It's interesting that you're talking about product design, because I feel like product design is something that graphic designers often don't look to for necessarily for inspiration, because it's just a different discipline. It has a lot of different concerns, you know.
Yeah, I mean, but for me, like, just as just speaking for myself, like, I think it's most of the things that I've ever been most inspired by are where I just went like, holy shit, like, God, I'll never do something that good. A lot of it has come from product design, you know. So like super obvious example, but like the first time you pick up an iPod, like you know exactly how to use it, but you fucking like love using it. Like those two things are really hard to do together. Or like on the digital side, like when like Gmail like just like redesigned itself, it looked like so gorgeous. But like I use Gmail 5,000 times a day, and like so I have to use it. But they changed the design. And did a really, really good job. So I like the way it looks. I like using it. Like I have an emotional connection with my inbox. Like, do you know how hard that is to do? That's so hard to do, you know? And those are both products, actually. I mean, one's a physical project and one is a digital product. But because of like my area of focus, like trying to take those lessons from what these masters who have been around for decades and decades have really figured out, and trying to translate that into the new medium is what I'm trying to do with my career.
Do any of you else want to share examples of things that you find just extraordinarily well done from another discipline that you look to for lessons?
Well, I think that we're always trying to look for inspirations from other disciplines other than graphic design. You know, I think that just with my experiences and also me being a graphic designer, I think our impulse is to kind of like look at the skin of things, meaning like how good it looks on the surface. You know, I think that a lot of graphic designers, for example, when they look at product design or furniture design, the first thing that they think about is how good it looks, but not the stuff that's actually behind it, you know, functionality, programmatic thinking, so on and so forth. But I find that when you're kind of, when you open yourself to practices or methods or, you know, thinking from other disciplines. For example, you know, can architecture inform how we think about design? Can architecture think about how we do digital stuff? You know, I think that once you begin to think across these media boundaries, I think interesting things begin to happen. You know, and I think that's, for me, that's what defines inspiration, because inspiration is when collisions happen from different contexts, you know, and I think that's oftentimes I think that's when innovations begin to happen.
Sure.
Yeah.
Anybody else want to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, so you guys seen the show So You Think You Could Dance? Fucking inspiring. I'm a sucker for like, you know, heartfelt stories, but just like watching people throw it on the line. I mean, it just gets me, and it's just such a, and it, you know, like, you know, I can dance, but I can't dance. And like when
That's
you see
all you ever wanted to do.
Exactly, and I ended up here. But like when you see someone who's the top of their craft, and especially with these young kids, and I'm using the show example, when you see someone just pour like their heart and soul into something like that, that's inspiring.
Anything from you, Rob?
Well, I think I might join Jordan on his walks, because I think that this is kind of the natural environment, and I was having a conversation with someone last night also about this, but the ability to sort of be in that kind of like the original, let's call it the original product design, where, you know, you can sort of just take a walk through nature and check out what's happening, I think is probably the most inspiring thing for me.
All right. Anybody have any questions?
That's not a question.
You gotta have some. Natasha, I'll ask you a question about your work.
Sure.
It seemed to me that actually the way you were describing how you derive the grid from sort of looking at Super Studio's work, it's a very architectural way of working. Is that something consciously that you did? I mean, because if you look at the way architects sort of present their projects,
Yeah.
it's always in this there's always a step before you
Right.
get
Well, I began to become interested in architecture about, few years ago, so I categorize myself as an architecture enthusiast, by no means I'm an expert, but what's interesting to me is their kind of process, architects are very methodic in their thinking, and also their work tends to take on a lot of iterations, one after another, in order to arrive whatever the final result is. For example, they can design a staircase for 300 times. How interesting is that?
Right.
So yeah, but I find it interesting because I think that it deals with surfaces, which is what graphic designers deal with, but it also deals with three-dimensional spaces, and I think that three-dimensional spaces in a very physical way, for example, like this room, but also you can think of it in a kind of very virtual sense. When it comes to digital, like I tend to think of digital stuff as basically the problem of 0 and 1, and how do you actually modulate that to create different kinds of spaces, and what is the circulation in that, what is the programmatic, zoning in that, and I think that opens up a lot of possibilities. I don't look at websites for website inspiration, so on and so forth. Yeah.
I think I missed a question, 2 questions down here. You in the striped sweater?
I have done. I have done several interactive projects, but nothing that sort of combines digital with physical and graphic in that sense, and that's something that I'm very interested in. But it's very hard to find opportunities like that. But I do believe that there are rooms to create that kind of opportunity.
And I think we had one more question over here. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, ideas come from everywhere. We kind of talked about that, and inspiration can come from many places. But when do you guys decide an idea, or how do you decide when an idea becomes a great idea?
That's a good question. I mean, I actually once asked Frank Gehry how he knows when to stop. And he gave me a really sort of nasty answer. He said, "How do you know that you're done making love?" Which I was like, "That's not very helpful." Wow. But yeah, sure. Does anybody want to take a stab at that question?
I think it's a myth, it's one of those like voila moments. You can't actually really say that, oh, this is this is a time when things are right. And sometimes when you hit that moment, say 3 days later, you may revisit it and find that idea totally sucks. I think that's the beauty of creative process, is that it's constantly morphing, it's constantly changing. It's very hard to say that this is great, even when the stuff is out in the market.
Yeah, I would second that. I don't think it's a question of when do you stop working on something. I think the aha moment is what thing do you pick to work on. So if you have 50 ideas, everyone goes, oh, aha, that's the great one. Let's actually start working on that now. Is sort of the moment. No, I mean, candidly, like, just to be like a dick, I think like you just feel it, like you kind of just know it when you see it, and if it's good, everyone will agree, So I think that at some point, like, design isn't a democracy, and someone has to take a stand, and you're right or wrong, but that's just what it is. So, but usually, hopefully, if you're right, people will agree with you, and if you're saying, oh my God, this is like the best thing ever, if you're good at your job, other people will agree with you.
Any other questions? All right, thanks you guys for coming.